Located deep within the brain, there is a Nexus Point, where millions of years of evolution and thousands of years of history interconnect with ancient spiritual traditions, occultism, and modern science. Sacred to the Greeks, Egyptians, and Sumerians, foundational in Hinduism, Buddhism, and Taoism, likewise venerated in esoteric schools of thought, it decorates the staffs of gods, is chiseled into sacred architecture, and hidden within the veils of myth. This Nexus Point is the pineal gland, and for thousands of years it has been taken to be a gateway to spirit, enlightenment, and higher dimensional realms. To this day, a complete understanding of its purpose remains elusive. Rather than being another decalcification tutorial, this video will be more of a history of science and religion perspective, and will be exploring its ties to mythical and symbolic ideas, and much more. The story begins, in some sense, with the Greek physician Herophilus, around the 3rd century BC. Often regarded to be the father of anatomy, he believed this small gland located between the two hemispheres of the brain to be a sort of valve. The function of this valve, which would come to be the prevailing belief throughout most of classical antiquity, would be to regulate the flow of pneuma within the brain. Pre-Socratic philosophers described pneuma as the primary substance underlying all existence, synonymous with breath, air, and spirit. What immediately becomes clear is that at the very beginning of the pineal gland's history in the medical literature is its association with spiritual concepts. The pneuma of the Greeks appears to be synonymous with the prana of the Hindus, both representing some vital essence, some breath-like force which sustains all life. Herophilus performed his work at the University of Alexandria in Egypt and recorded these findings in 9 volumes, all of which are now lost. As a result, our knowledge of all this is largely due to Galen of Pergamon, one of the most accomplished physicians of antiquity whose writings have been preserved. In Galen's first description of the pineal gland, he coined it the conarion, simply meaning pinecone, the cone of a pine tree. Galen was well aware of the mystical significance that preceding physicians had given to the pinecone-shaped gland. Though such notions might have stemmed from Eastern traditions which were ancient even in his day, Galen outright rejected its function as a valve for pneuma. He criticizes these ideas, writing, quote, "The notion that the pineal body is what regulates the passage of the pneuma is the opinion of those who are ignorant of the action of the vermiform epiphysis, and who give more than due credit to this gland." Statements like this, however, would do little to quell the rise in mystical speculations. In fact, for the better part of the last 2,000 years, determining the primary function of this tiny gland would remain a subject of long-standing debate. As mechanistic science grappled towards an understanding of human anatomy, so too did esoteric science. Eastern traditions mapped a total of 7 major energy centers along the spine, and curiously enough, modern science recognizes 7 major endocrine glands in a similar manner. But before we go any deeper into those ideas, there is one more crucial development which must be made clear. Ever since the human found itself to be conscious of itself, shamans, sages, philosophers, and theologians around the world would aim to locate the immaterial body, the soul. Might it be found in the head, or perhaps the heart, or was it equally dispersed throughout the body? The Italian philosopher and theologian Thomas Aquinas held that the soul is entirely contained within every part of the body. It is well known that the Egyptians believed the soul to reside in the heart. Before the deceased could enter the afterlife, the heart was weighed against the feather in the judgment hall of Osiris. Until the 17th century, the soul was generally associated with extended parts of the body. That was until Descartes, speculating on the mechanisms of the pineal gland, comments, "While it has the primary function to receive the psychic spirits in the same way, and since it is the only solid part of the whole brain which is unique, it is necessary that it is the seat of the sensus communis, that is to say, that of thought, and as a consequence that of the soul, for the one cannot be separated from the other. Descartes then proposed that the pineal gland was the seat of the soul, that is, the physical point where spirit and body converge. This seemed to be a pretty reasonable assumption for him to make. He inferred that due to the gland being the only unpaired structure of the brain, having no left or right hemispheres, and likewise that one can only entertain a single thought at a time, that this must be the location of the individual's spiritual essence. The pineal gland plays a crucial role in mediating our transition between wakefulness and sleep. It does this by releasing melatonin in the presence of darkness, a process which is inhibited by light. In this way, the pineal gland acts as the gateway between conscious and unconscious. By the same token, the melatonin it produces is vital for fertility and overall reproductive health. In recent decades, we've discovered a lot about the pineal gland. Despite losing some of its mystery, however, there's still much that remains unknown. In fact, even a full understanding of pineal melatonin is unclear. And this has led some to ask, could melatonin have any relation to the alleged spiritual properties of the gland? For starters, the pineal gland converts serotonin into melatonin, which are in fact both tryptamines, via a process of acetylation and methylation. The tryptamine structure encompasses a wide range of psychoactive compounds, including ergolines, bufotenine, psilocin, and DMT. Though yet to be proven, it has been hypothesized that the pineal gland may produce DMT, potentially being involved in dreams, near-death experiences, and altered states. Since the gland is known to convert tryptamines through methylation, and that DMT is a methylated tryptamine, structurally similar to serotonin, it is possible that it could be produced within the gland. Through cerebrospinal fluid channels nearby, any molecules produced in this gland have easy access to the brain's sensory and emotional centers. Before we go any further along those lines, I believe it would be worthwhile to explore the symbol of the pinecone. Where does it appear within mythology, and what archetypal significance does it have? Bearing in mind the known functions of the gland, along with its supposed connection to the soul, we could thus apply these attributes generally throughout our search. We begin our search in an ancient kingdom, where its inhabitants are known for wearing conical-shaped hats. Phrygia was home to a god of vegetation called Attis. Roughly 3,300 years ago, in the region where modern-day Turkey resides, there emerged a cult surrounding this deity. Legend has it that one day Attis unmanned himself underneath a pine tree, and after bleeding to death, was transformed into one. The death and resurrection of this god became a 3-day festival annually performed by the Phrygians. On the 22nd day of March in spring, a pine tree was cut and carried to the sanctuary of Cybele, the goddess of fertility and consort of Attis, where it was treated as a great divinity. An effigy of Attis was placed within the hollowed-out pine, followed by various customs over the first 2 days. The third day marked a frenzy of religious ecstasy and clashing instruments. Participants gashed themselves and spattered their blood on the sacred pine. Later on, these instruments of fertility were buried in the earth, or in subterranean chambers that were sacred to Cybele. On the morning of the 25th of March, the vernal equinox, the god was resurrected, and a festival of joy followed. To the Phrygians, this god was seen as a tree spirit, and it was specifically the pine tree which was sacred to them. This famous statue depicts him with a wreath of pine cones and other fruits on his head. Several authorities on the subject have noted that the pine cone was held sacred to the Phrygians. They were regarded as symbols or instruments of fertility. Furthermore, the pine tree of Attis, with its parallels to the cross of Christ, appears to be closely interlinked with his death and resurrection, and the renewal of vegetation in spring. Pine tree, pine cone, death, resurrection, fertility. As an archetypal symbol, the pine tree represents long life and immortality, as the evergreen tree is unaffected by the descent into winter. We moderns use it as a symbol for Christmas, the event in which God assumed a human form. Pine trees, more broadly classified in botany as part of the conifer group, are among the most ancient trees on Earth. The name conifer is a Latin word, simply meaning the one who bears a cone. Their origin can be traced back in the fossil record to a time exceeding 300 million years ago. And as of now, the oldest known living tree is a member of this family. The archetype of the wise old tree rings true here, as these towering figures have passively looked down on life since the age of the dinosaurs. Botanically speaking, the cones of conifers act as the reproductive structures of the tree. The female cones produce seeds, and the male cones produce pollen. Different environmental conditions lead to the cones either opening to receive or release pollen, or closing to mature seeds. This process continues even after older cones have fallen to the forest floor. It's fitting that pine cones express the Fibonacci sequence as well, intricately arranging their scales into spiraling forms. It's quite remarkable how even in something as seemingly mundane as a pine cone, there opens up a world of complexity and meaning that mirrors ours. The pine cone is a phallic symbol of remote antiquity. It topped the staff of Dionysus, the god of wine, vegetation, fertility, and religious ecstasy. On this subject, Manly P. Hall says, quote, "The whole form of this scepter is symbolic of the spinal cord, its natus and plexuses, the pineal gland, and the pneumogastric nerve, all closely related to the mysteries of regeneration." Dionysus was the ancient god of the vine, associated with indestructible life, intoxication, subterranean rebirth, and of course, the Eleusinian mysteries. The throne room of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal features a relief panel that is heavy with symbolism. Centered in this symmetrical scene is the Tree of Life. Mirrored on each side is the king, and behind him are protective spirits raising pine cones up to the rear of his head. This motif appears again in Mesopotamian art, this time in the hands of the Apkallu sages. These figures, also known as the Seven Sages, have been the subject of much debate with respect to the handbags they carry. It's a whole other rabbit hole on its own. However, the general consensus among most is that the Apkallu were the bringers of knowledge, sent by the gods to impart wisdom to human beings. The presence of a pine cone in this imagery seems to reinforce that idea, especially when its potential broader significance is taken into consideration. Now, if the pine cone didn't carry a long legacy of symbolic importance, intimately linked with tales of regeneration and eternal life, ways of knowing that transcend physical limitations, then why would the central courtyard outside the Vatican library feature a giant pine cone? And if the pineal gland, the sacred pine cone in man, as expressed by Manly P. Hall, didn't happen to be in the precise location of the Ajna chakra, the upper dantian, and the crown sephirot, then how far from the truth was Descartes when he assumed it to be the seat of the soul? And further, is it simply a coincidence that it happens to contain all the necessary precursors for the so-called spirit molecule? To begin unraveling this web of synchronicities, we'll shed some light on the evolutionary history of the pineal gland. It is well supported in evolutionary biology that the pineal gland in humans evolved from an actual photoreceptive organ. This feature is known as the parietal eye, pineal eye, or third eye, and it was present in early vertebrates, as well as some amphibians and reptiles today. The parietal eye of both extinct and living species contains a lens, cornea, and retina, and it was capable of detecting changes in light intensity, which played a role in regulating circadian rhythms. As life evolved, the pineal moved inward, deeper into the brain, and as a consequence, lost its direct photosensitivity. But as we now know, it kept this evolutionary link by still functioning as a sort of indirect light-sensitive organ. Rather than directly sensing light, it relies on signals sent from nerve cells in our retinas in order to regulate melatonin production. That the pineal gland has an evolutionary connection to an actual visual organ was first discovered around the turn of the 20th century. At this time, interest in the occult reached new highs, with seminal figures like Madame Blavatsky, Rudolf Steiner, and Manly P. Hall bringing ideas to Western consciousness as never before seen. H.P. Blavatsky's second volume of The Secret Doctrine takes this discovery to the absolute fringes. The mind of the East made landfall in the West, and its influence was far-reaching. In combination with the rise of mechanistic science and the downfall of religious dogmatism, a path was opened to create a synthesis of the two. It seems more often than not, those cryptic, ethereal utterances from Eastern yogis centuries past tend somehow to correlate, or at the very least resonate, with modern scientific findings. That being said, it becomes quite remarkable to read how Shiva, one of the most prominent gods of the Hindu Trinity, is described as, quote, a god of ambiguity and paradox, the erotic ascetic, the ithyphalic and promiscuous god, who is also a celibate yogin, practicing austerities in the Himalayas. He is the three-eyed god who has burned desire with his third eye, who dances in the cremation ground, and yet who seduces the sages' wives in the pine forest. Now, as with any foray into comparative religion or symbolism, one runs the risk of getting drunk on symbols. With this statement, however, I can't help but feel as though there are many layers of deeper meaning nestled inside. What that is, I can only speculate. A three-eyed god, the polarity of asceticism and promiscuity, a pine forest. Regardless, considering the fact that from humanity's mythical consciousness came a deity with a third eye, which symbolized knowledge, extrasensory perception, the ability to detect and destroy evil, and enabled access to spiritual realms, is fascinating on its own, insofar as it resonates with modern science, that at one time there really was a third eye, which has since atrophied into the pineal gland with all it entails. At the very least, further illuminates the capabilities of outmoded forms of consciousness. Eastern traditions often refer to the third eye as a sort of inner eye, the mind's eye, or the eye of consciousness, whereby through dedication and practice, the enlightened can attain perception of the inner spaces of consciousness. Specifically in Hinduism, the location of the third eye corresponds to the Ajna chakra, which is understood to be the direct link to Brahman. This is essentially ultimate reality, the non-physical, eternal truth, pervasive and unchanging, formal and final cause of all that exists. Such concepts are mirrored in Jewish mysticism. The Kabbalistic tree of life is crowned with Keter, which symbolizes the initial point of emanation from Source. It is the pure, undifferentiated white light of Ein Sof, the infinite source, nothingness, which was revealed to Moses by the burning bush. It is the source of all creation. Both Western and Eastern mystical traditions speak of a blinding white light, where during deep spiritual realization, one is made witness to all that really is. Moreover, one doesn't have to read too many accounts of near-death experiences to realize this to be a common experience there as well. It is here where we begin to reach the crux of the matter. With all these motifs, ideas, and discoveries in mind, the pineal gland, the third eye, the pinecone, death and resurrection, fertility and rebirth, pure white light, and so forth and so on, that we can now turn our attention to an astonishing connection made by the psychiatrist and psychopharmacologist Dr. Rick Strassman. The Tibetan Book of the Dead is a funerary text of 8th century origin, whereby its purpose is to function as a guide for mediating the process of death and directing the soul's journey through the various stages of the afterlife. Traditionally known as the Bardo Thodol, meaning liberation through hearing in the intermediate state, the text remained hidden, intentionally buried deep in the mountains of Tibet. Upon its discovery by a 14th century mystic who unearthed a cache of scriptural treasures in the snowy peaks, the Bardo Thodol would be passed down through a long lineage of teachers until eventually reaching the West, where it would be translated and come to be known as the Tibetan Book of the Dead. 3 stages comprise the intermediate state, where the recently deceased has the opportunity to liberate itself from the cycle of death and rebirth. Now, what's relevant to our discussion here are 2 things. The first is that at the moment of death, one becomes witness to a clear light, and this is believed to be a direct experience of one's own essential nature. The second is that this process between death and rebirth lasts 49 days, with each Bardo lasting 7 days. That's 7 sets of 7 days, 7 times 7, resulting in a total of 49 days, or 7 weeks. A curious choice in number, as it accords with so many other significant things. 7 planets, 7 colors, 7 chakras, 7 sages. We could be here all day. But what about the number 49? As it just so happens, this duration of time marks 2 significant events during human embryo formation. 49 days after conception, differentiation between male or female gender begins, a landmark event on its own. Further still, 49 days is also when we see forming the first signs of the pineal gland. Now let me ask you this. Just how could it be that an ancient Buddhist text, written during an age where the light of modern science didn't shine, could be describing the cycle of reincarnation, death and the rebirth of the soul into a new body, as a process which takes the same amount of time as it does for one of the most decisive aspects of the human to take shape? And further still, how could it also happen to be the same amount of time for the first indications of the so-called seat of the soul? If the pineal gland really is the seat of the soul, as Descartes surmised, then perhaps all these distant connections are more than just chance. Reducing it all to mere coincidence is easy, but what if that isn't the case? It's almost as though some archetypal resonance is at work here, morphic resonance we might say. The form of the pinecone becoming manifest in one of the 7 major endocrine glands, which at one time were called the 7 chakras. Its appearance in myths and symbolism, in which it carries similar attributes as the actual gland. Perhaps the first Cartesian mind picked up on this archetypal resonance, which factored into his naming it the seat of the soul. As I'm sure many can relate, my views on subjects like this are pretty liquid. There's certainly no shortage of garbage online relating to this stuff, and it was my aim with this video to provide a more balanced perspective, one that shows just how this little gland really does serve as a nexus point, branching out into so many other fascinating subjects that I hope to explore in future videos. And on that note, thanks for watching. As always, stay curious. Peace.